wake me up to another good morning, time to go.
Are you ready to explore God's wild and wonderful world? Welcome to the Nat Theo Podcast. I'm your host, Erin Lynham. I'm a certified master naturalist, Bible teacher, and author, and I am so excited to dive into God's written word, the Bible, and His created world with you. Listeners, I love receiving your nature questions in my email inbox every week. You have such great questions, and I love seeing you so curious about God's wild and wonderful world. Starting this week, we will be answering listener questions at the end of every episode. So stay tuned to the end to hear questions sent in by listeners like you. And if you are curious about God's creation and want to hear your question answered, get permission and head to erinlynham.com/ask or the link in our show notes so you can record and send in your question. I am so excited to begin our newest series today on the human body. We are calling this series Wonderfully Made, because as we will learn all about God's designs in the human body, including human cells, DNA, our hearts, and our brains, we will discover that we truly are wonderfully made. As Psalm 139 verse 14 says. Have you ever heard that verse? It says, "I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." We are going to dive into some incredible designs in this series. And when I say incredible, I mean incredible. Like, some of them are kind of unbelievable, but they are real and really cool. Some of the lessons, like today's on human cells, might be a bit sciencey, but don't worry. I will make sure to explain all of the new words, and also don't worry about memorizing everything. Instead, my hope and prayer is that as you learn about these incredible designs inside your body, you will stand in awe of how God has made you so special. I used some really great resources while researching for this series, including my son's school book by Apologia Curriculum titled Exploring Creation with Human Anatomy and Physiology. It's kind of a joke between my son and me because as he was doing his homework and using his textbook, I kept coming up and saying, "Hey, can I borrow that? I need that for my research." What I love about Apologia's Human Anatomy and Physiology course is that it breaks down really big, sometimes complicated ideas into smaller, easier to understand explanations. Using colorful pictures and diagrams and analogies, Apologia helps my son and me better understand how God has wonderfully made us. In fact, I will be using some of their explanations on today's episode to help us understand all the many amazing things happening right this second inside our microscopic cells. Discover Apologia's award-winning science curriculum, including their human anatomy and physiology courses for elementary through high school at apologia.com. Have you ever wondered what your body is made of? Maybe you think about skin and blood and bones, but what are those skin and blood and bones made up of? Today we are zooming in, way in, to learn exactly what our bodies are made of. Here's our trail map.
Are you ready?
We will learn what is a cell and what are the three main parts of a cell. We will learn how is a cell like a city with buildings and workers, and how does Jesus hold everything together? All right, listener, here is our trivia question. How big is the largest living cell? Today, we are going to learn about these teensy weensy cells inside of our bodies and inside of every living thing. Now, most of these cells are so tiny that we cannot see them except through a microscope. However, some cells are large enough to see with only our eyes. And I'm going to give you a hint. A single cell that is large enough to see with your eye is an egg. An egg is a single cell. So back to our trivia question, how big is the largest living cell? Take a guess and we will find out at the end of today's episode. So what exactly is a cell in the human body? On past episodes, you might have heard me talk about cells as if they are building blocks in living things, such as plants and animals and humans. And that is true, but it's a bit of a basic explanation because cells are much more complex than, say, a Lego block or a brick that you might build a tower with. Now, for a long time, scientists did think that cells were very basic and simple. They thought they were basically just watery blobs inside of our bodies. So let's travel back in time for a quick lesson on how humans discovered cells. It began in the year 1665. A man named Robert Hooke, who developed a type of microscope, looked at living things under his microscope and noticed tiny block-like structures, or kind of like little containers. They reminded him of the little rooms in a monastery where monks live. Those rooms were called cells. So Robert Hooke named these tiny blocks inside living things cells. However, like I mentioned, those cells were thought to be very simple, just little watery blobs. That is, until almost 200 years later, in 1839. In the 1800s, microscope designs got a whole lot better, and scientists could see things a lot closer and a lot clearer and with more detail. In 1839, so 185 years ago, there were two German biologists, or scientists studying living things. Their names were Theodor Schwann and Matthias Schleiden. They came up with something called cell theory. These two scientists discovered that all living things are made up of cells, and that cells are the building blocks of life. In fact, an adult human body has around 30 trillion cells in it. And as a child, your body has around 17 trillion cells in it. Now, that's not 1,700 or 17,000 or 17 million or even 17 billion. Your body, listener, has around 17 trillion cells inside of it. As we dive in and learn more about these tiny cells, I think you will discover that you truly are wonderfully made. Well, as technology has improved, we have gained a deeper and clearer understanding of what cells are and how they work. And it ends up that they are not simple at all. So as I explained, they're not just like building blocks. I have heard cells talked about like they are little factories, which is true. But I think they are even more complex than that, or more complicated. I think they're more like a full city full of buildings and workers. Have you ever been to a big city? What was it like? There was probably a whole lot going on, including lots of traffic from cars and bicycles and buses and people, and lots of people going to and from work. There were probably lots of buildings also, and important things happening inside of those buildings. A cell inside of your body is like a busy city. Okay, now we know that every living thing, including us, is made of cells, and that a cell is busy with lots of things going on inside of it. But what exactly is going on inside of a cell? Let's zoom in closer and take a look inside a living cell. Let's first look at the three main parts of a cell. As we talk about each part, you can see them in the Nat Theo Club lesson guide. So let's start at the very outside of the cell membrane. The cell membrane is kind of like the wall of the city. It lets some things in and out of the city or the cell. Everything inside the cell is held in by the cell membrane, unless it needs to be let out. But that would be a whole nother podcast episode. So for now, just remember that the cell membrane is like a wall that some things can pass in and out of. Inside of the cell membrane is a whole lot of liquid, kind of like water, and that liquid is called cytoplasm. Cyta means cell, and plasm refers to liquid. So cytoplasm means cell liquid. At this point, you could kind of think of a cell like a water balloon. Have you ever filled up or played with water balloons? The elastic, rubbery part of the balloon would be like the cell membrane, and the water inside would be like the cytoplasm. But cells are much more complex than water balloons because inside the cytoplasm, or that liquid, there are a ton of little tiny things floating around. So now you could picture a water balloon with glitter inside. Those tiny things floating in the cytoplasm or cell liquid are called organelles. Now that's a funny word. Does it sound like any other word that you might know? Organelle sounds like organ. Do you remember what an organ is? An organ is a special part inside a body with an important job to do. Your heart and brain, which we'll be learning about in the coming weeks, are both organs. Your liver, kidneys, and lungs are also organs. They have very important jobs in your body. Well, an organelle means little organ. Organelles are little things inside of our tiny cells that have very important jobs to do. They are kind of like our cells' own organs. Just like the big organs in our bodies, the tiny organs called organelles have important jobs to do inside of our cells. Do you remember what the three main parts of a cell are? Think about the water balloon picture. On the outside of the cell is the cell membrane. Inside the membrane is the cytoplasm or cell liquid. And floating inside of the cytoplasm are tiny organelles or little organs doing very important work. The organelles are like buildings and workers inside of a city. So let's zoom in a little closer and learn about some of those organelles, some of the buildings and workers inside the cities of our cells. But before we do, I have a question for you. Why do you think it's important to learn about the human body? As I have been studying the body, I understand God's love for me more deeply. I can see how He carefully and wonderfully made me and those around me. In this way, I love studying nature and science because it draws me closer to God. But do you know what is very important while we study nature and science? To also be reading and studying God's Word, the Bible. Because the Bible, nature and science go hand in hand. They highlight each other because all of them point us back to our Creator God. So while studying nature and science, I also study the Bible. My family loves using the Dwell Bible app to study God's Word. Every single day, Dwell publishes an audio devotion for both adults and kids. We can also listen to Bible reading plans and choose what voice and Bible translation we want to listen to. We can also choose peaceful music or nature sounds to play in the background as the Bible is read. It is very customizable so that we can enjoy listening to the Bible and devotions while removing distractions and focusing on God's truth and love. Nat Theo listeners can save 25% off on a subscription to Dwell at dwellbible.com/nattheo or at the link in our show notes. So how exactly is a cell like a busy city with buildings and workers? You might remember that I described a cell as being kind of like a busy city with buildings and workers. Well, those organelles, or little organs that we just learned about, those are the buildings and workers. When you think about a busy city, what kind of buildings do you picture? Maybe stores or factories, or police stations, or a post office, or all kinds of different businesses. And when you think about workers in a city, who do you picture? Maybe mail and package deliverers, or trash workers taking trash away, or businessmen and women, or authorities like people who make laws, or policemen and women. Well, it ends up that a lot of similar buildings and workers are inside of our tiny cells. Let's look at a few of them. As we do, don't worry about memorizing all of the funny names. Although if you would like to, you can use the Nat Theo Club lesson guide to help you learn more about each part of the cell. But instead of memorizing every silly name, just have fun learning about all the things that are going on inside of your body right now, and be in awe of how God engineered all these tiny pieces to work together so that you can live. Now, we won't have time to look at every type of organelle. God simply made too many of them for the scope of this lesson. But let's look at a few key organelles and their important jobs. A very, very important organelle, or little organ, inside of your cell is called the mitochondria. Can you say that? Mitochondria. In our little cell city, the mitochondria is like a power plant, or maybe like an energy station. Like if you've ever been walking around town and seen a big fenced off area with large machines that deliver power or energy to the city. The mitochondria create energy for our cells and other organelles so that more cells can be made so that we can keep living and growing. This is very important because the human body creates over 1 million new cells every single second. That requires a whole lot of energy. So how exactly does the mitochondria create power? From the food we eat. That's why your parent or caregiver might encourage you to eat healthy foods, because the mitochondria power plants inside of your cells need the nutrients from that food, and they turn the nutrients into energy that your body uses to do everything you do. You see, the food we eat is broken down by our bodies, and then the mitochondria power plant turns the nutrients from that food into energy. That energy is called ATP. ATP are like the batteries that power our cells, and the mitochondria charges up all of those ATP batteries. Now, in a city, you might see one power plant or a few energy stations, but in each of our cells, there can be a few dozen or a few hundred or even thousands of mitochondria power plants. Think about that. Dozens to hundreds to thousands of specially designed mitochondria power plants inside each of your 17 trillion cells. Now, some cells need more mitochondria power plants than others, like the cells that create our muscles, because our muscles need a lot of power. Okay, let's look at another organelle, or little organ, called the ribosome. In our tiny cell city, the ribosome is like the printers. Have you ever gone to a copy and print shop where you got copies of paper printed? That's kind of like the ribosome. Except the ribosome is not like some big shop. Instead, it's like a bunch of printers found throughout the city. Why might the cell need to create copies or print something? Remember that in the human body, over 1 million new cells are made every single second. The ribosome are like printers inside of our cells that are helping to print up everything we need to create all those new cells every second. And we need a whole lot of these printers because, guess what? Your body began as a single cell. And now you have over 17 trillion cells inside of you, with 1 million new cells being made every single second. So those ribosome printing machines are very important and very busy. We'll learn more about this copy and print process next week when we learn about DNA. But for right now, just remember that the ribosome are like printers. Okay, we took a tour of the mitochondria power plant and the ribosome printers. Now, let's meet some of the workers inside of our cells. Let's first meet some of the print shop workers that work with the ribosome printers. Now, first, it's important to understand that ribosome printers in our cells are not exactly printing up a bunch of flat pieces of paper. It's more like a 3D printing machine. Have you ever used one of those? We have several little toys in our house that were printed by 3D printers, including a bluebird, an octopus, and lizards. Well, the printers in our cells create a 3D shaped thing called a protein. Now, our bodies have many different kinds of proteins, and they are incredibly important. In fact, proteins do most of the important jobs that we are learning about in our cells. We'll learn more about proteins next week. For now, just remember they are very important in our cells and bodies and have lots of important jobs to do. So the ribosome printers print 3D proteins. But sometimes those proteins need some finishing touches to make them just right for their important jobs. When my kids and I were learning how to use a 3D printer, the person who taught us, they showed us that sometimes when a 3D object is finished, it needs some finishing touches, like extra pieces cut off or sanded down. This is the same with proteins being printed by the ribosome printers in our cells. So there's another category of organelles or tiny organs that act like these print shop workers making those final touches. They are called endoplasmic reticulum. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you repeat that one. Well, okay, only if you want to. Endoplasmic reticulum. But for short, they are called ER. All right, let's look at one final organelle or little organ inside of our cells called lysosomes. Lysosomes act like a cleanup crew. They can break down and get rid of old, worn-out organelles that our cells no longer need, keeping everything fresh and clean and operating well. And they can also help get rid of dangerous invaders like bacteria. But lysosomes don't only get rid of trash and waste. They can also act like a recycling crew. Lysosomes help break down the food that we eat and turn it into materials that our cells can use. Do you remember the first organelle that we talked about, the mitochondria power plant, and how it turns our food into energy? Well, here is where the lysosomes come into play because they help with this important job. The lysosomes break down our food into very basic parts that the mitochondria power plant can use to make energy. The lysosome recycling crew recycles the food we eat, breaking it down so that the mitochondria can turn that food into energy. So the lysosomes are a very important cleaning crew that helps keep things neat and tidy so that our cells can function the way that God designed them to. Now, our tour of the cell is not over yet. Next week, we are going to look at the most important organelle inside our cells. We need an entire episode to dive into that organelle. It is called the nucleus, and it is like the city capitol building or control center. It's where all the important decisions for our cells are made. Next week, we are going to tour that nucleus capitol building and see how exactly God makes us, well, us. We'll discover a very important thing inside our cells called DNA, which is like the code that makes our cells and bodies, and how DNA is one way that God wonderfully made you. Listener, think about if your cells were missing just one of these important organelles. Think about if the mitochondria power plant shut down and your cells had no power to do all of their many jobs or to create 1 million new cells every second. Or think about if all the ribosome printers got jammed up and could not make new proteins, which do most of the important jobs in our bodies. Or think about the ER print shop workers and what would happen if they up and quit work one day and the very important final touches could not be made to our proteins. Or consider if the lysosome cleanup crew quit and our cells filled up with old dead materials or could not break down food into basic pieces that the mitochondria needs. Every piece of our cells, from the outer cell membrane like the city wall, to the cytoplasm cell liquid, to the many, many types of organelles or little organs inside of our cells are necessary. You see, all the systems in our bodies working together, especially in our tiny cells, reminds me of one of my favorite verses in Colossians 1:16-17, which says this: "For in him, Jesus, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Did you catch that last part? In Jesus, all things hold together, including all the amazing parts inside of our cells. All right, it is time for our listener questions segment. This listener questions segment is brought to you by Branch Basics Cleaning Products. As we are learning about human cells, it's important to protect our tiny cells and all those systems inside of them. With Branch Basics, my family went from using 52 ingredients to only 22 ingredients from nature to clean our home, dishes, and laundry. As a mom, I have so much peace of mind when my kids are using Branch Basics, knowing they are safe and made from nature, utilizing God's designs. You can save 15% off your premium starter kit when you use the code NATURE at branchbasics.com/nature or at the link in our show notes. Again, use the code NATURE to save 15% on a premium starter kit at branchbasics.com/nature. Here is our listener question.
Hi, my name is Will. I'm 6 years old, and I want to know how air plants grow.
What a great question, Will. Air plants grow like most other plants by absorbing or taking in nutrients from the air and water. They also use the sunlight to make their own food through a process called photosynthesis, which we have talked about on past episodes. Of course, plants also get nutrients from the soil. They use their roots kind of like straws to suck up nutrients from the soil. But air plants do not need to do this. Now, they do have roots that help anchor them to surfaces, but those roots, unlike other plants, are not in the soil. Instead, they are able to get what they need from the air and sunlight and some water. A lot of people that grow air plants, they will put them in water from time to time to help them grow. The air plants take in nutrients that they need through tiny scale-like structures on their leaves called trichomes. And like other plants, air plants can also bloom and produce seeds so new air plants can grow. Thanks for your great question, Will. Stay curious about God's wild and wonderful world. And listeners, if you have a question you would like to have answered on Nat Theo, get permission and head over to erinlynham.com/ask or at the link in our show notes. Do you remember our trivia question? How big is the largest living cell? Remember that I gave you a hint. A cell that is large enough to see is an egg, and the largest living cell is an ostrich egg. An ostrich egg is a single cell, and it can be around 6 inches long and weigh around 3 pounds. That's a very large cell. Now it's your turn to explore. Find something tiny and alive in nature. Maybe it's a small beetle, or a fruit fly, or a tiny leaf on a branch. Observe what you find and think about the many, many cells inside of that tiny living thing. God's creation is far more detailed than we can even imagine. As you observe what you find, remember Colossians 1:17. Jesus is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this lesson, please take a moment to send it to a friend and subscribe, rate, and review Nat Theo wherever you listen. Until next time, keep exploring God's wild and wonderful world.
I think as parents, we assume that kids are going to just know the right way to do things. You have to teach them first and then train them by teaching them to do it over and over again until they actually get it.
Imagine trying to teach your child how to tie his shoes without the practice principle. If the practice principle is vital for teaching such morally neutral task as tying shoes, how much more important is it for training children in Christ-like character?
I speak to parents all the time who come up to me and they see what's happening, but they don't know what to do. And I just want to stand up and say, you can do this. Here is a solution.
This is Yvette Hampton, host of the Schoolhouse Rocked podcast. Join us each week for a new episode as we offer encouragement and resources on biblical discipleship from popular speakers and authors, as well as parents just like you and me. Find out more at schoolhouserocked.com or listen anywhere you find your favorite podcast.